Previously, we learned how to identify the problem, okay, in an economy. So that means deviation from the full employment. Today, we continue to lay out the foundations for policymaking. Today, we are going to look into the quantitative aspect of policymaking. So this semester, we have learned the directional effect of, for example, an income tax cut, okay, or an increase in consumption. Okay. So we learned that with an increase in consumption, we are going to have an increase in aggregate demand. If the government increases its spending, we are going to have an increase in aggregate demand. But we have not talked about how much. When it comes to policy making, the quantitative effects of a policy is very important. So today we're going to talk about that. So what we're going to learn is a phenomena that happens in the economy called multiplier effect. So I'm just going to say it up front here. When it comes to the quantitative effect, we have to recognize that in the economy that we live in, we observe multiplier effect. What that means is if there is a dollar change in a component of aggregate expenditure, either one of the components of aggregate expenditure, for example, consumption, investment, or government spending or net exports, it will lead to more than a dollar change in the aggregate demand. So take for example, if the government increases its spending by $1, in the economy that we live in, eventually we're going to see more than $1 increase in aggregate demand. Okay. So how does that happen? Okay. So it's like a magic. It's not a one-to-one relationship. How does that happen? How does the multiplier effect take place? So I'm going to bring you to the appendix at the end of the PowerPoint slides. I do want you to bear in mind that I am not going to test you on the quantitative effect. I'm not going to test you on the numerical derivations of spending multiplier that we will soon see. Okay? But the reason that I am bringing you to the appendix is I want you to know the intuition that underlies the multiplier effect. So here we go. So let's pick a large company. Normally, you would probably choose Google, okay, or Amazon, okay, or Boeing, okay. So large companies, Apple, okay, large companies that probably has some impact on the macro economy. So let's try Google. Okay, so Google. So suppose Google decides to cut its investment by $100 million. So it doesn't want to build a big lab. It doesn't want to replace some of its computers. It doesn't want to buy some new machines. So all in all, it cuts its investment by $100 million. So we want to know how that will affect the U.S. economy as a whole. Okay, so straight away, most of us are tempted to say 100 million, of course, right? Investment is a component of aggregate demand, as we have learned. So the aggregate demand should probably drop by $100 million. But as we have mentioned briefly just now, we have multiplier effect. So what happens then? So think of it this way. Google initially cuts its investment by $100 million. So those businesses who used to get business from Google, now they don't get the business. Okay? So those contractors who used to build office, lab for Google, they now don't get the business. Those computer suppliers or equipment suppliers who used to sell equipment and computers to Google, they now don't get the business. Those IT support companies, okay, that used to support the computers or the network for Google, they now don't get the business. So all these people will be affected by the action of Google. Okay? So what Google does not just stop at Google. It spills over to other economic entities in the economy. So these other people who used to get business from Google, now they together have lost an income of $100 million. Of course, they feel poorer. So they probably don't want to spend as much in dining out anymore. They probably don't want to spend as much on vacation anymore. No more shopping, okay? And so on and so forth, okay? So in other words, they will cut down on their consumption. Okay? So initially, Google cuts its spending by cuts its investment spending by $100 million, but the effect on the aggregate demand doesn't stop there. Okay? So now we see that other people who are affected by Google now, they will cut down on their consumption. By how much? Well, let's say the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. Okay? So for every dollar change in income, a representative individual in this person gets, he or she will change his or her consumption by 75 cents. So now, these people who used to get business from Google, they have experienced a loss of income of $100 million. So that means they will cut their investment by, they will cut their consumption by 75% of $100 million. So that's $75 million of induced decline in consumption. Okay? So the story doesn't just end there, because all these people who used to get business from Google, they cut down on their consumption. They don't shop as much, they don't dine out as much, they don't take vacation as much, they don't buy new cars as much, and so on and so forth. So these will affect other economic entities in this economy, because departmental stores don't get as much business anymore. Travel agencies don't get as much businesses anymore. Restaurants see a decline in business. Car dealers see a decline in business, and so on and so forth. So all these retailers or all these other economic entities that are affected, they will also cut down on their consumption, because they together experience a loss of income of $75 million. So now they will cut their consumption by 75% of $75 million. So that's further decline in consumption. Okay? So the story goes on and on and on and on. Okay? So what happens here is an initial decline in investment by Google translates into a loss of income of some economic entities in the economy. So these economic entities cut down on the consumption, which translates into further loss of income of other economic entities in the economy, which translates into further decline in consumption, and so on and so on, so on and so forth. So that's how we get the multiplier effect. So that's a long story. So now let's summarize the story a little bit, so that we know the total change in aggregate demand. So how will that affect the aggregate demand? So initially, there is a decline of $100 million in investment. Okay, so we have a negative here that indicates a decline, because when we're talking about change in investment, we have a negative sign here, that's a decline. Okay, so initially we have 100 million decline in investment, 100 million times 1. Okay, and in the second round we have 75 million decline in consumption, so that's 75.75 multiplied by $100 million. And then the third round, we have people cut down on their consumption by 75% of 75 million. So that's the square of 0.75 multiplied by $100 million, and so on and so forth. So we go on and on and on and on, virtually infinite number of times. Okay, so that's when we stop. Okay, 0.75 to the power of infinity. Well, many of you probably have your head spinning right now. I mean, what do we do with this? Okay, it is still messy. However, this is what we call in an infinite geometric series. So what is in the parentheses is what we call the infinite geometric series. And thanks to mathematics, the whole thing in the parentheses is approximately equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.75. Okay, so that makes our life much easier. So I don't need you to understand this. Okay, but I would like you to understand is the intuition underlying the multiplier effect. So what is more important is this one, 1 over 1 minus 0.75. That will give us 4. Okay, so that means at the end, when Google cuts its investment by $100 million initially, at the end, the aggregate demand would decrease by $400 million. Okay. So when you look at this story here, so this 0.75, what does that represent? So let's recall the story. What does that represent? Is the marginal propensity to consume, is the MPC. Okay, so now we can go back to our PowerPoint slides. So what we have just learned is the formula for spending multiplier. 1 over 1 minus MPC. Okay. So this is the simplest form of spending multiplier, the basic form of spending multiplier, in the sense that we have not taken into consideration the effect of foreign trade or imports. So that means we're considering a closed economy. Okay. So 1 over 1 minus MPC, that will give us the spending multiplier. Previously, we learned that the sum of the marginal propensity to save, MPS, and marginal propensity to consume, MPC, is equal to 1. So that means you can also find MPS by subtracting MPC from 1. So that will give us an alternative expression of the spending multiplier. It's the same formula. Okay, so just alternative expression. Okay, so a little bit of exercise. So suppose the MPC is 0.75. What will be the effect on the aggregate demand if the investment declines by $100 million? So why don't you take a few minutes? Many of you probably noticed that this is exactly what we did just now, but I still want you to make it a habit to practice solving the problem. So let's pause for a few minutes for you to solve the problems. Okay, I hope you have took a few minutes to solve the problem. So let's go over it together. It is similar. It is actually exactly what we have done for the questions in the appendix. So this is how we set up the question. So change in aggregate demand is equal to the initial change in either one of the components of aggregate expenditure multiplied by the spending multiplier. So the initial change in components of aggregate expenditure in this case is $100 million decline in investment. So we have negative $100 million here. And then the spending multiplier, 1 over 1 minus MPC. So that will give us a spending multiplier of 4. So the aggregate demand declined by $400 million. So what we have just discussed is a basic form of spending multiplier that is in a closed economy. So that means we assume that there are no international trade. So we don't have to take into consideration the change in income on imports. But obviously, you know that has not been the case for many, many decades now. We live in a very globalized economy, so it probably makes sense to have a modified version of spending multiplier. So I'm not going to go over the derivation again. The intuition is very similar to what we have just seen in the appendix. Okay? So 1 over the modified formula of spending multiplier that takes into consideration foreign trade or imports is 1 over MPS plus MPI. So that's marginal propensity to import. Basically, that's how much the change in imports in response to a change in income. Okay, so alternatively, we can also write the formula as 1 over 1 minus MPC plus MPI.